Residential sales comparison and income approaches, page 12. Specific function within the development process as illustrated in figure 1.2 on page 11. Problem identification. Problem identification consists of identifying information the appraiser uses to determine the scope of work in an assignment. This step is also referred to as identifying the problem or defining the problem. Here the appraiser identifies several elements: client and intended users, intended use, type and definition of value, date of value opinion, relevant property characteristics, assignment conditions, the appropriate valuation methods and techniques such as whether the sales comparison and/or income approach will be applicable, meaningful, and produce credible, worthy of belief results are realized from what the appraiser learns during problem identification. Therefore, the appraiser should not abbreviate this process and must consider problem identification as being significant in his development. Communication with the client will be necessary to determine most of the elements that must be identified. The exemption is identifying the relevant property characteristics for which the appraiser has the sole responsibility to determine. Let's briefly review the elements of problem identification. Identify the client and any other intended users. The client is the party who engages the appraiser in an appraisal assignment and with whom the appraiser has an appraiser-client relationship. An intended user is a party identified by the client as at the time of the assignment. The client is always an intended user in an assignment. Additional intended users may be specified by the client when the appraiser is engaged. Note: an additional intended user may or may not have the same need or use as the client. For instance, the sales comparison approach may best satisfy the intended use of the client, but would be of little value to an additional intended user for a different intended use for which the income approach might produce the most credible assignment results. Identify the intended use. An appraisal is the basis for some type of a decision. What that decision will be or the intended use of the conclusions is a primary. Extra notes. The appropriate valuation method subject. I don't know what that word is. What stage is it? Problem identification. During the problem identification, there's a good little bit of calculations on the test. Don't worry. In problem identification, the appraiser identifies information he then uses to determine the scope of work in an assignment. Page 13. Driver of the research and analysis that is performed during the appraisal's development. The intended use is the use or uses of an appraiser's reported appraisal, appraisal review, or appraisal consulting assignment, opinions and conclusions, as identified by the appraiser based on communication with the client at the time of the assignment. Note: similar to intended users, different intended uses might require different research and/or analysis, or at different levels, which approach to use, and the techniques that should be applied are strongly affected by the intended use. Identify the type and definition of value. The type and definition of value are sometimes referred to as the purpose of the appraisal. Care must be taken not to confuse the purpose of the appraisal with intended use. The purpose of an appraisal is always to determine a value opinion for a defined type of value. Identifying the type and definition of value specific to an assignment prompts the appraiser to utilize the valuation methods that will produce the most credible result. It also alerts the appraiser of transaction characteristics to look for when choosing comparable data. For example, the appraiser must be certain that the sale price of the comparable data being analyzed is reflective of the same type of transaction for which the data is being applied. In a market value assignment, the appraiser must be certain that the comparable data is being extracted from the transaction that represents an arm's length transaction. As we will discuss in greater detail later, some elements of an arm's length transaction can be addressed by adjustments in the sales comparison approach, such as financing concessions. Other adjustments may be difficult, if not impossible, to isolate, such as for haste or duress. Market value is the value conclusion most frequently specified in an appraisal. However, other types of value can be derived based on the appraisal's use. The type and definition of value should always be appropriate for the appraisal's intended use. Note, both the sales comparison and income approach can be useful for developing a market value opinion. However, there are types of value for which one or both of these approaches will not be a good indicator, and the cost approach is most useful. For example, insurance value and investment value are typically not developed using the sales comparison approach. Extra note, a factor something multiply. The client is always an intended user in an assignment. Additional intended users may be specified by the client at the time of the assignment. The research and analysis that is performed during the appraisal's development is primarily driven by the intended use of the appraiser's opinions and conclusions. The purpose of an appraisal is always to determine a value opinion for a defined type of value and must not be confused with the intended use.